Hello everyone, today we're going to be going over lesson 3, which is if statements and loops. So today we're going to talk about if statements, logical conditions, and then the while loop and for loop. So if statements are used to execute a section of code based on a certain condition. So these are called conditional statements because based on a certain condition, it'll execute a certain block of code. So the syntax is if, and then you have these parentheses, and then within the parentheses, you're going to tell what the condition is that needs to be true in order for this block of code to run in these curly braces. So whatever you put in the curly brackets will be run if this condition is true. So if this happens, then this piece of code should execute, is basically the structure. So for example, here, let's code this. So over here, for example, it's got if 24 is less than 29, then it will print out 24 is less than 29. And so the condition here is that 24 must be less than 29 for this to print out. So why don't we try running this and let's see if this works. Yeah, so prints out 24 is less than 9 because this statement is true, right? 24 is definitely less than 29. This is what we call a logical condition. Okay, and that brings us to the next topic, which are what exactly are logical conditions? Well, these are different conditions that you can check using if statements and loops as well. So this one is the equal to condition. So you always have to use a double equal sign, not a single equal sign, because a single equal sign is used for assignment, used to assign a variable to a value. But a double equal sign is used to check if two values are equal. So these can be used for all data types and not just numerical ones. So why don't we try this out? So why don't we have this statement say, for example, if equals 29, then we're going to say 24 equals. And we're also going to make a new if statement that says if 24 equals 24, we're going to say just to make it more organized, you can do that. And now let's check, see what happens. Yeah, so this obviously isn't true, right? 24 is not equal to 29. So because of this, this statement will not print out. And this code the code between the curly brackets will not execute. But in this statement, this condition evaluates to true, right? 24 is equal to 24. So that's why this code runs. So now why don't we look at not equal to? So this is basically checks to see if one value is not equal to another. And so you can always do this with variables as well. So why don't we have integer variable called int1 and we'll set that to 24. So why don't we say if int1 24 is not equal to, and that we use the exclamation with an equal sign to say not equal to 29, then this code should print out. And let's see what happens. So this code prints out, right? Because this condition is true, right? 24 does not equal 29. This condition evaluates to true. So this block of code prints out. So as you can see here, these are based on Booleans, right? It's based on whether a condition evaluates to true or to false, which are what Booleans are all about, right? You can have either can only have two states, true or false. So this is why Booleans are important. They're used for conditional statements. Now let's look at less than. So it basically checks if one value is less than another. We already basically looked at it. It's just the less than sign. And we already checked when we did if 24 is less than 29. And just like that, there is also the greater than, which is the exact opposite. It checks to see one value is greater than another, and then that condition is met and that code will execute. And then we've also got less than or equal to. So basically this condition is met if one number is less than or equal to another. So why don't we try this out? Why don't we have, and the syntax is less than sign and then the equal sign. So here we'll just do int1 is less than or equal to 21, and then we're going to do here. Let's see if it runs. Yeah, so these two conditions work, right? 24 is definitely less than 29, so this condition still evaluates to true. And then even though 24 is not greater than 24, it is equal to 24. So that's why this also works. Now let's move on to the else statement. The else statement is used to specify a block of code to run if the if statement's condition is not met. So because of this, we always write the else statement after the if statement because the computer reads code from top to bottom. As you can see in this example, so the syntax is just you have to write else and then you just have to have curly brackets. And inside the curly brackets, you will specify what code you want to be executed if this condition is met. Why don't we try this out? Instead of having this if statement, we'll just say else. And now let's see what happens. This statement didn't print out. And why did that happen? Well, that's because this statement evaluated to true. And so the else statement only runs when this statement is false. So that's why this else statement did not run. But if I change this so that it's not true, so for example, if I change this to greater than, then let's see if this runs. Yes, so this statement prints out because this if statement was evaluated to false and this code did not run. So now let's move on to else if statements. So else if statements are used to specify a new condition to test, a new code to be executed if the above if statements are false. So the syntax here is just else if and then parentheses with a certain condition, and then this, and then the curly brackets. And of course, inside those curly brackets is the blocks of code you want to be executed. So why don't we try this out? Note that the else if statement only runs if the if and else if statements before it evaluate to false, and you can have as many else if statements as you want. Why don't we? Should be. And then we'll make another one that says else if 24 is less than 29, we're going to print out. Now let's see what prints. So this if statement ran, and only this if statement ran. Well, why is that? So this only ran because the statements above it all evaluate to false, right? 24 was not greater than 29, and 24 was not equal to 29. So these two things didn't run. So that's why this one ran. So why didn't the else statement run? Well, that's because this else statement only runs if all the above conditions are all not true. If none of this is executed, only then this will run. So if you can see here, these are all linked together, right? So always you can only, in this chain, you can only have one if statement, and then the rest will be else ifs. And then you can choose to have else, but you don't need to. It's basically a chain. So for example, if I had another if statement here at the bottom, this starts a whole new chain, okay? And it doesn't matter what conditions here were executed, which ones weren't, because this starts a whole new chain and it does not look at what happened before. So if I print out something here, this will print out because it doesn't look at what happened before. So let's run it just to make sure. Yeah, this prints out. It does not look at what happens before. So also note that it's not necessary to have else if statements. It's not necessary to have else statements. You can have just an if statement. You can have just a if and else if statement. You can have just a if and an else statement, and that's completely fine. Just know that this is how the chain goes, that it always starts out with an if statement, and if there's an else statement that always, if there's an else if statement that always comes next, and then it always ends, this chain always ends, if there was one with an else statement, that always comes after all the else if statements. So now let's move on to while loops. So while loops are used to repeat code while a certain condition is true. Hence the name while loops, right? Keeps looping through some code. So the syntax here is you just write while, and then you have your parentheses, and inside the parentheses you have a certain condition. And then you have curly brackets, and within the curly brackets you can specify what code you want to be repeated while this certain condition is true. And when this condition turns to false, the loop will stop and that code will stop being executed and stop being repeated. So why don't we test this out? So here, why don't we have this variable int1, and then we'll do while int1 is less than, let's say, 30. We just want to print So now, how many times do you think this loop will run? So maybe pause this video, take a moment to think on that, and then unpause when you think you've got the answer. So the answer is it'll actually run an infinite amount of times. And that's because 24 will always be less than 30, right? So this condition will always be true. Therefore, this code will keep on repeating an infinite amount of times and your computer's going to crash. So the way we avoid that is that we want to change this variable inside the loop so that at one point it will stop. And the way we do this is we will add 1. And to do this, you can just do plus plus comma plus plus semicolon. That's equal to saying int1 equals int1 plus 1. So that's all you're doing. We're just adding 1. So what happens is that as it goes through the loop, right, int1 value will keep changing. It will keep increasing. It will go to 25 and then 26, then 27, and eventually it will reach 30. And when that happens, this loop will break because this condition is no longer true, right? Int1, now that it's 30, is no longer less than 30. So this loop will stop. So let's run it and let's see what happens. Yeah, see, so first int1 was 24, then it was 20, then it became 25, 26, 27, 28, 29 as we kept adding 1 to it. And then when it became 30, this condition evaluated to false, so this loop no longer ran and it no longer printed out int1. So that's the basis of basically how while loops work. You can also, for example, you can also use strings at a condition. You can also put if statements inside of while loops if you wanted, for example. So let's say we wanted to print out hi after the 27th, like it's shown here. How would we do that? Well, we will use an if statement inside the while loop, right? So that's what, because we want the while loop to keep running after that, right? So we don't want to do anything to this condition, and we don't need to make another while loop or do anything like that. We just have to write a statement inside the while loop that checks for when int1 equals 27, and then we want it to print out hi, but we want it to keep running and go all the way to 29. So let's print out hi. And then, of course, we want to add 1 to it. Yeah, so see, so first int1 was 24, it became 26, 25, 26, 27. And as soon as it hit 27, this statement evaluated to true, right? And so it printed out hi. But then afterwards, we added 1 to it, so it became 28. So this statement no longer evaluated to true, but this condition was still true, so it still kept running until it reached 30. So that's how you would do while loops, and that's how you would do statements inside of while loops. Always make sure that the condition that you specify inside the while loop will not remain true forever. So that's why, for example, we added 1 to int1 each time. Or you can also add it, you can also have it increment by 2 if you want it to print out only even numbers, for example. If this was, for example, flopped and this was 2, you can also have it, well, this is decreased by 1 each time. So the only thing is that you have to make sure that at some point this condition will evaluate to false and this loop will stop. So now let's move on to for loops. For loops are used when you know exactly how many times you want something to run. And so it's basically the simpler and shorter form of while loops. And the syntax is you will write for, and then inside your parentheses, you will define a variable. It has to be a numerical variable, like an integer or float or something like that. You want to specify a condition that while this condition is true, this block of code will run. And then of course you want to, basically it's called an iterator, where you change the variable you defined here, and you will change it so that at some point this condition will no longer be true. So in this for loop here, for example, this is the variable we defined. We just defined a random variable, we called it count. And then we're saying here is that the condition is that count must be less than 10 for this code to run and for the computer to print out the variable count. And then here we're adding 2 to count. So first count is going to equal 0, and then it's going to be 2, 4, 6, 8, and then when it reaches 10, this loop will stop. So why don't we code it and run it? So I'm going to delete all of this. Just going to do for int count equals 0. See, we're only using the single equal sign here because we're assigning the variable to 0, right? We're assigning something. So that's when you want to use the single equal sign. And I'm going to say while count is less than 10, and then we're going to add 2 to count. Wanted to print out this variable. Now let's see what happens. Yeah, so you can see here, since we were going by 2, it did only the even numbers. So if I wanted to do only the odd numbers, how would I do that? Well, it would you just want to change this to 1 and then run it. And so it's going to go 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. And yeah, so it prints out all the odd numbers. So you don't have to just go by 1. You can also decrement, or instead of checking to see if count is less than 10, we can check to see count was greater than 10, and we can have count be 20. And then of course we would want to decrement by 2 or by 1 because we don't want it to go on forever. And we want it at some point to be less than 10. Yeah, so it goes 29, 20, 19, 18, and goes all the way to 11. But when it reaches 10, count is no longer greater than 10. So it stops running and the loop stops. So that's basically it for today's lesson. And let's just go to the coding challenge assignment. So the link is this link. I'm just gonna copy it and so if you see here, I've given you some reference examples where you can see how to do an if-else statement, how to do a while loop, and how to do a for loop. And so basically all you have to do is you have to create 2 integers, you have to write some if and if-else statement, you have to write an if statement, an else if statement, and else statement to correctly do this part. Then you'd have to do a while loop, and then you'll just have to make 2 for loops. Oh, and then there's also a challenge. It's completely optional, but just to see what happens if you make a for loop inside a for loop. So that's basically all I have for you today. Thank you so much, and see you next time.